experience of them.
Do you know why? Yeah. Some are more successful than others. What are the terms?
Well, The Edge of the City, for instance, was a video piece that he reckoned was not successful. In that, he had a monitor placed in a suburban street and viewing the street, or rather a camera viewing the street, and then the monitor was a couple of miles away in an urban concourse, a railway station, and his aim was to somehow link the centre and the periphery of urban consciousness. But he said that it didn't really come off for the simple reason that it just didn't survive. It didn't register. It didn't actually arrest people's attention in the conditions of flux and rush hour at the station. And so I think he had quite a fine sense of the gradation of the successfulness and the viability of the things. There was one that I remember him saying that it was a video delay chamber piece, where once he'd constructed it, there were certain simple conditions of the time elapsed between walking from one monitor to another, that it just didn't technically work, and that there's an element of actual experiment in the construction, and not completely conceptual in that sense.
But I mean, I think that like Andrew's question raises a kind of vital point. I mean, I would want to argue that as to the question, you know, does it matter whether it's constructed or not? Actually, I would want to say yes, it's vital that it is, though it's quite difficult then to go on, you know, because after all, the first problem you have is to ask, well, what is it in this case that's being constructed? I mean, it's nothing that obeys the artistic fantasy of construction. I mean, it's not kind of original. It's not. It is not there that the technique of the artist is being tested. Indeed, Andrew had asked me earlier on, you know, to what extent did I think that the pergola upstairs had more than a kind of modicum of malice about it being displayed in the AA. And unfortunately, about 2 hours after he asked me this, Friday's a dreadful day because the conservationists come in for their course. And I'm afraid I did hear one say to the other, like for the first time ever in the AA, I rather like that. This sort of, you know, kind of naff heritaged sort of garden centre object that's up there. So, you know, one is faced with more than the usual problems about the question of construction and materialization. But it does seem to me that that it is absolutely of the essence that it is built because you know, otherwise it's not just an idea. It's like a sort of critique of something, or you know, and here it partakes in the important status of being an object, however difficult that object is to describe, and however in whatever roundabout fashion you have to come to produce your value of it. And indeed, however powerful it is on destroying certain of your illusions about what a constructed object is. But nonetheless, none of this, I think, would happen unless it were constructed. And there is something there, you know, which distinguishes a critical art from an art of criticism.
And the same also applies to the performances, because they're so simple, as you were saying before, that the performance artist relation with the mirror, those performances are very, very clear when you see them on video. And when you start describing them, they become more complicated than they need be. Just as when he's describing his own presence in front of the audience, he's saying, my hand is in my pocket. We already know that, we can see it. And there is that time delay also between the visual image and the description of it. And I think there's also one's own body in relation to what one is experiencing and the environment, which is absolutely not repeatable, or you can't experience it in any other way but by experiencing it. And you can listen to any kind of theorizing of a performance. It's like someone telling you what this evening was like. Unless you're there, there's no substitute for direct experience. And that sense of presentness, which he's working with all the time, means that I think there's a huge gap between theory and actuality.
I mean, at that level, it seems to me, only a pipe can say, "This is a pipe," and it does it by not having to say it. Once you say it, you're in kind of the register of language.
And that's, I think, another link to Gary Hill's work, actually, because Gary Hill is so involved with language and that relationship between, say, in Tall Ships, that absence of language, but the relationship between in this case, the other person, not a mirror image, but your presence triggering the action of the other person in relation to you. And then when he discusses, when he deals with language and the written word in pieces like "I Believe It Is an Image in Light of the Other," where he's transposing, he's going into Blanchot and transposing language and images of the body. It's very connected, I think.
Yes, at the back.
My architectural and sort of geometric terminology is not very good, but in most of Graham's work, there's a kind of all the displacements seem to take place in a kind of horizontal, lateral way, and a kind of a vertical or sort of rectilinear order always seems to be in place. The monitors and the cameras are always at kind of head or chest height, and whether it's in the glass and mirror works, the mirrors are always completely vertical. So that vertical and kind of horizontal coordinates are completely separated out, and the displacements take place sort of horizontally, and they can kind of be foregrounded as such, because one set of coordinates, my maths and things isn't very good, one set of coordinates is kind of kept entirely in place. So I don't think you really get a complete sort of bewilderment in any of Graham's work, because there is definitely a very kind of preserved order going on. And it makes me think that there's something to do with time being fractured in a very, very linear way. It's rather like, a tape being sort of taken apart and sort of put back together in different sections, but it's still incredibly lateral, it's still incredibly sort of horizontal. Whenever you're in Graham's work, there's more movements of the head sort of left to right than up and down, and it seems so consistent in his work that it's as if none of these displacements could be made if all sense of geometry was kind of thrown to the wind. It's like for every displacement there needs to be a kind of Euclidean moment as well in order for the work to articulate what it wants to. He seems in many ways, a very two-dimensional artist. I don't mean that in a derogatory way.
Perhaps that's also because so many of the works involve whole walls being mirrors, and the mirror is designed to be seen frontally. And it's interesting, I find what you say very interesting in relation to if you're looking at Bruce Nauman's video corridor, or other artists using time delay who've used, in a way, that more vertical format, if you like, where the lateral movement possible is really restricted and you're obliged to walk down a corridor. and then walk back again. And so the emphasis is on the vertical, and it's much more controlled. Your movement is much more controlled. Whereas in Dan's pieces, there's much more of a sort of democratic invitation to do whatever you will. It's much more participatory, and I think one of the key things about his work is that he really transforms the relationship between the artwork stroke artist and the viewer. There really is a participation to a much more complete way than in the rather sort of dictatorial confines of Nauma's live tape corridor, or even for that matter David Hall's corridor, or Tony Hill and other British artists working with video in the 60s and early 70s. They all use corridor spaces and that much narrower sort of vertical axis. So what I think what you say is very interesting, because Dan Gray does the opposite, as you say. But that also allows for a much greater movement. I mean, he was very influenced by and interested in and knew well the work of people like Trisha Brown and Yvonne Rayner and Simone Forti and other artists who also, as Sol LeWitt did, were working with movement and seriality in movement, and perhaps that also influenced it, I don't know.
I think it's got a lot to do with whether, as you were saying, the model should be built or not, and I think in certain circumstances it's vital, because when you look at a model, you're in that kind of godlike sort of position of looking at an object, and looking at an object as if it could give rise to certain experiences, which it can't if it maintains its status as an object. Something you kind of look down at these pieces. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, and I think everyone, when they look at alteration of a suburban house, tries to get down to the height of the mirror to kind of make it rectilinear and kind of try and inhabit a model, which is rather odd. But for me, the skateboarding piece seems miles away from other Graham works, in that it is far more three-dimensional, and it is a far more sort of bewildering and chaotic set of possibilities that it gives rise to, because things are moving away from the rectilinear. Things get far more sort of kaleidoscopic with what's going on in the kind of roof bit of that skateboarding well.
But there is one piece that very expressly is in mind. It's a mutual description piece of video in the early 70s, in which he has a woman and a man describe each other in front of the audience by means of video, although they can also see each other directly. Neither of them have any photograph, and he placed the man standing up on a chair, looking down on the woman who was seated in such a way as to replicate the stereotypical position of men in sort of patriarchal positions.
I was very interested in that observation about the kind of horizontal and vertical. I hadn't thought of it myself, but I think it's absolutely right. And it's probably worth thinking about a bit further, because there's something kind of highly sublimated, if you like, about Dan Graham's work. Very, very controlled to the point of a kind of rigidity, while at the same time desiring the loss of control, and desiring a kind of desublimation, which will take place elsewhere. It won't be, in a sense, it'll be children, or skateboarders or teenagers or whatever. Fascination with teenage, and perhaps even with a kind of drug culture, but a drug culture of the other, in a way. Fascination with ecstatic religion. And it's almost as if the work is governed by a kind of polarity, as if, it can't afford to let go. It would be too dangerous to do that. So it's kind of desublimation is not something that can be played with, that the control has to be maintained, and the sort of ecstatic aspect has to be projected elsewhere. I mean, it just strikes me there may be some relation with that.
There is that one other piece, which is the Children's Pavilion, which is the collaboration with Jeff Wall, that you probably know, which also doesn't have that kind of same rectilinear sort of structure. And I agree with Michael, and Dan talks about the importance of play. And actually I find the pavilions quite playful in that, one's invited into them and to experience them, and particularly that Star of David one. In the documentation, you see the children actually kind of playing in it, and I think that's the space. It's like he's given that to the viewer. He's given that the theatre, or the kind of like loss of control is given over to us. It's not coming. He does keep it in control with the vertical, horizontal. Sorry.
I mean, I think just to when you say there's a certain lack of verticality, maybe another way of putting that is that there is a fundamental indetermination of scale. Someone referred to the exhibit in the other room, as the model of a house. By what right do you call it the model? Now, obviously, there are certain conventions, including architectural inventions, that if you see like a little house like that, you say it's an architectural model, with the assumption somehow that then it will be built to scale. Now, some of those conventions, necessary they may be to kind of practical life, are incredibly kind of tyrannical and misleading. It's very interesting that architecture always persuades us that the idea of a model, that is, being a representation of the real thing yet to come, is intrinsically smaller than what is yet to come. And a number of very important things kind of hang on that. It builds into our mind that there is something about a representation or about a model which is kind of smaller. The only person I think who kind of systematically argues against this, is Levi-Strauss, where he says, the work of art, no matter how big, is small. I mean, and there's but we need to be able to actually have analytic categories and ways of discussing the question of scale, which break down simply respecting the kind of conventions. Now, I mean, maybe in some sense things really do have a scale, but because we're used to conventions which we would insist, like units of measure, that they are arbitrary, perhaps there is actually another level at which objects might have a real scale, no matter what scale they are produced at. I always remember here being on a jury where a student very brilliantly came in with a little kind of like child's suitcase, in which were three what were called models of the Pele's Tower in Docklands, and they were each, as it were, I think about sort of 6 or 8 inches high. And you suddenly realize, looking at it, that is the real scale of that building. The one down there has just been kind of, needlessly kind of blown up to a kind of ridiculous, it's not 1-to-1, it's just too big. Literally overblown. Now, not to mention too boring and too expensive and ridiculous. And, but then, so the question is that one might ask, let's say first of all of Dan Graham, is, how big are Dan Graham's objects? Now, for the pergola, one might imagine that though it needed to be constructed, it may be a good deal smaller than it is up there. And then how big are those things there? Now, one of the reasons why I think his manipulation of the indeterminacy of scale is actually very brilliant, is because that indeterminacy is something bears in a kind of obscure way on the question of like ubiquity, on series of objects which, by appearing in the world, also kind of eradicate location, so that they are sort of everywhere and therefore kind of nowhere, because, as it were, precisely we don't know how big space is, for a relevant object, unless we have kind of some sort of sense of kind of location. So I've put that kind of badly, but it bears on the question of a series of objects which are ubiquitous, which may tend actually to be in their real scale rather small. Bryony.
Can I just pick up a point about scale in relation to what Chrissie said a while back about the Bruce Nauman corridors? Because it seems to me that perhaps rather than being somewhat controlling or dictatorial, in fact, the problem with those works for you or me is that your own scale in relation to the space that surrounds you is so compressed that it's very uncomfortable and creates certain kinds of anxieties that wouldn't correspond at all with the sense of this being a kind of all-controlling space, but rather that it's a space of fantasy in some respect. And it just struck me in relation to some of the remarks that Michael made about Michael Fried. Part of Fried's problem with minimal objects was that, this term anthropomorphic, which gets bandied about by all camps as far as I can see, as a pejorative thing for art to be, and these minimal works are somehow anthropomorphic because, they're like people somehow in this theatre that, modernist painting is meant to defeat. And almost, although obviously he's not talking about Nauman, he's talking about earlier stuff, it is this idea that the walls of those corridor spaces are rather like people kind of being right up against your nose, and not allowing you the kind of distance that is appropriate. And I suppose, just finally, it seems to me that perhaps Nauman's very, very reduced and compressed spaces possibly have a funny sort of link with these Dan Graham installations that would seem to do the opposite, because by endlessly seeming to, extend the space of the room, the boundaries of the room are obviously rendered unstable as well, but possibly cause, anxiety in a comparable way. It's excessive, whichever way you take it, and Graham in the Mirrors tends to just take it in the other way.
Can I add something to that? Because I think it's fair, that's a very interesting remark, because in a sense from what you're saying is that what came out of minimalism as revealed by Fried is this compression, this reduction of distance. Now, I wonder if one could then see Dan Graham as taking things, as it were, one step further, in the sense a logical kind of next step from that, which is what I tend to see as this sort of catastrophic dimension of his work. As the distance reduces, suddenly you get the point where subject and object, inside and outside, collapse. And I mean, you can see this sort of extended and developed in the pavilions and pergolas, etc., where you get the reflections of inside and outside of you and the other, all kind of conflating and exchanging. And that, to go back to sort of Mark's remark about space, it's almost as if you get this kind of compression of space that you're talking about in relation to minimalism, this reduction and this thing being sort of forced up against you. You then get this kind of catastrophic reversal using mirror, video, etc., and you then get this, I wonder if this kind of indeterminacy of scale is what emerges kind of on the other side of this catastrophe as a kind of loss of experience, loss of the body, and then the emergence of a different kind of sense of scale and space. I don't know if either you or Mark want to take that up.
I mean, this seems to me like, but then it would, like another register of like what happens, what's experienced, kind of when the object gets too close, which kind of I've defined as what we mean by the ugly. And maybe that is a possibility. What's interesting, I think, is that the compression doesn't just have to be an enclosure, because it can also be those things like the time delay, because in a sense that shows me that I have that I do not possess either the time or the space which I thought I had. It's either on the one hand things can get too close to you, enclosing you and generating a sort of sense of claustrophobia, or or you attend the sort of robbery of yourself, in which those spaces and those times which you needed in what had been the conventional term to use, to be, are kind of considered sort of no longer yours. Different people will, as it were, choose one or the other way of illustrating the catastrophe. Well, it's both the catastrophe that happens to all of us, but which of course merely conceals that we're all catastrophes. I mean, it's not that actually we'd be okay if these things didn't happen. I mean, we are simply, by virtue of being human, the catastrophe waiting to happen. So that's kind of our fate. But some people will tend to experience it and describe it as being, as it were, immured, and some of like having crucial bits of themselves lopped off, and including the bits of time and the bits of space which they thought they needed, although curiously they don't.
I'd like to return to the question about the horizontal again, and taking it in a direction. First of all, when mirrors reverse, they perform lateral inversion, not vertical inversion, which is a very strange fact, but I think that's quite important. And secondly, Dan has said on many occasions that some of his work, since he started working with pavilions, has been a kind of negotiation with Mies van der Rohe and with the sort of consequences of the open plan. Now, in Mies's adaptation of the open plan to the museum, you have two horizontal planes, and those planes are dogmatic. The floor and the ceiling. There are no domes and there are no steps down. It's simply two dogmatic horizontal planes. On the other hand, your movement in that horizontal plane is potentially infinitely open, because there are no enclosed rooms, and you can drift and you can move endlessly through that open plan. And I suppose that was the basis of the Situationists' idea of a utopian gallery in the New Babylon by Constance, which is a sort of endless art gallery. Now, Dan has also said that one of his starting points was working with the installations of Dan Flavin, in which lights were installed instead of art objects, or the art objects were the source of light rather than the reflections of light, and that this in turn created the experience of seeing the other spectators in the art gallery as the reflected objects instead of the other way around, as it were. So there was an identification between the visitors or the spectators' body and the artwork, which was somehow lodged in a wall, except that in the ideal modernist art gallery. It's not an enclosing wall. It's simply a space divider. Now, it seems to me that somehow Michael's discussion about the sort of reiteration of the artwork in terms of the institutionality of its framing sort of comes in here. And one body of work that seems to deal with a similar kind of catastrophic or mise en abîme experience of the repetition of the representation within the art gallery is a sequence of paintings by Art and Language called Incidents in a Museum.
You look at me like I have to... rather than talk about art language, and just to mention the other piece of architecture that springs to mind that Jeff Wall refers to, which is the Philip Johnson House, which illustrates, what I mean, I suppose, by this idea of the catastrophic. It might link with this notion of the gallery kind of somehow capturing the visitor. And what Jeff Wall points to is the moment of reversal of the kind of power relation of the gaze in the change from day to night, when instead of the person inside looking out, the people outside would look in. And he describes that as a kind of moment of vampirism, which then would link back with perhaps some of the things Mark was talking about, and the object getting too close and so on. And back to Philip Johnson. This is probably a non sequitur, but you wanted the sort of response, so what can I do?
But that in the Johnson building is kind of avoided by its location in the aristocratic landscape.
By keeping people out.
Yeah. Of the landscape, avoiding the issue of the building. If that building was placed in a different location, then that what you described would happen.
But I mean, in a way, isn't it almost more fearful in the landscape? I mean, the description of Jeff Wall has to do with the consciousness of the person inside, of being looked at in a threatening way, and in a way that can't be controlled from without. And there could be terrible things happening outside. I mean, one might think of Jeff Wall's Vampire's Picnic, for example, as something that's taking place somewhere outside. I mean, we've all had that experience of, closing the curtains because of being aware that one is suddenly looked at by a gaze that one can't control, that one doesn't have a reciprocal relation with anymore.
To change those since 1949, but that view got rapidly in those years.
Also, I think it's interesting what you say about Dan Flavin, because what Dan Graham also said about Flavin was he was interested in that relationship between what happened when Flavin's work was switched on and when Flavin's work was switched off, that when it was switched on it existed and when it's switched off it didn't, which is the same with video. And that, that relates to his this quote about actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. I think that connection is interesting.
I once saw a switched off Dan Flavin in a German museum with a sign, "This Dan Flavin is out of order."
By the way, we're doing a Dan Flavin retrospective at MoMA next year, just a quick...
What's the ad?
I think we seem to be sort of...
Sorry about that.
Does anyone have any other questions or interventions? Because otherwise I think we ought to begin to end. No? Okay, then first of all I'd like to thank the visiting speakers, Chrissie Iles, Judith Goddard and Michael Newman. I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank very much some of our collaborators from Camden Art Centre are here. And above all, I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking Andrew Mackenzie, who's borne an enormous kind of burden of work with this exhibition, and Brian. Okay, thank you very much indeed.